Welcome to an interview with part of a series of conversations with industry-leading professionals across the risk and governance markets. My name's Rob Starkle, Managing Partner at the Risk Partners. I'm excited today to be joined by Nicola Crawford. Nicola is the Chief Risk Officer at National Bank of Kuwait, MD of iRisk Europe, and co-founder of Women in Risk. Nicola, welcome. Great to have you with us today.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks for inviting me.
Really nice to have you as part of the series of conversations that we're having. So I'll tell you what, let's launch straight into it. I'm interested to hear what attracted you first to a career in risk management?
Well, actually, I fell into risk management. It wasn't a planned strategy. Yeah. I've actually, and it's interesting because I actually do understand a lot of people have also fallen into risk management by accident. But I started off life actually working in the public sector and working in road. So, I think of the safety angle and strategy, and I was a policy analyst as well for the the what you call it in New Zealand, Land Transport Authority. So I sort of came at it from more of a societal risk rather than organisational specific. And then the first time I had a job with risk management in my title was when I worked for the Country Fire Authority in Melbourne, which was very interesting. Volunteer organisation of 70,000 volunteers to deal with bushfires. So of course, there's a lot at stake. So it makes you more attuned to risk and risk management. And because of course working in Australia had the first standard in the world on 1995. So so that I think that helped. So it wasn't planned, but I wouldn't change it.
Oh really? You've found your calling.
Well, I think so. I think because risk is also linked to should be linked to so many other organisational processes such as strategy, financial performance, and I would like to see happening more of and I've seen it recently actually, where CRO becomes a CEO. Yes. Because it's the job of the CRO or the head of risk to understand everything that's going on in the organisation, which gives you a good grounding to be able to manage the organisation from a CEO perspective.
And that's a really good point, actually. We are seeing that a lot more across the market now, where CROs are taking that step into being the CEO. Historically, it's been much more the finance route. It's been the CFOs who've been taking that step up. So it's really great to see that. And I guess it makes sense if you are having risk management at the heart of everything that you're doing. It's got to come from the top. And if that's the mindset, then your firm is much better geared to doing that. Kind of then sort of dropping back, there'll be people watching or listening to us today that are at the more, I guess, the earlier stages of their risk management career. Obviously, you've been through this process and learned lots along the way. Is there any advice that you would give to those who are perhaps starting out of any particular things to look out for?
I would just to make sure that you do have the tone at the top and management support, because when you start introducing risk in an organisation, or you look at the culture of risk in an organisation and risk management, making sure that it's not a tick box exercise. Yes. So, and obviously different cultures have different impacts. I look at, say, for example, in the Middle East, Turkey, I mean, it's changing now, but, in the old style command and control structures, where it's the embedding is done more with the stick rather than the carrot, and for me it's always the carrot makes more sense because it's more sustainable. Yes. So just being able to articulate the benefits of doing risk management, making sure that it's not bolted onto a job but rather integrated within a role, to ensure that management get the value out of the process. I think, and that does need to be refreshed on an ongoing basis. Yes. Yes. And in your experience, do you tend to get a real sense, a real feel as to if an organisation has that drive and that you're putting risk at the forefront? Can you sense that? Can you feel it in day-to-day activities? Yeah. I mean, I've been doing this for more than 20 years, and I can even actually not without talking to people, where I can just look at the style of the reporting or minutes of board meetings and things like that. You get a sense of what given. Is to me, when you sit at an executive committee meeting, and you've got a full integration of financial performance and operational performance with risk rather than a separate report. So that gives you a good sense that there's integration that's good. Yeah, and of course, when you talk to people, you do get that, oh, I haven't had budget for this, I've got no resources for that. Look, you still need to be careful that people don't try to game it to I've seen organizations where risks are heightened somewhat, particularly if you're using a subjective process to try and secure resources or budget. So, but yeah, so as I said, I get a sense from when you talk to people and the style of MI reporting that's undertaken. And of course, it depends on the industry. Obviously, more heavily regulated industries, of course, this stuff has been, it's been organic in its the way that it's been applied, because you have to. So, I mean, the stick comes externally, and I think after a while, if you realise the value that you can get out of the process and be more efficient about the way you implement it, then you start to see those benefits. And there are some industries that are not regulated, where again you just have to look for, I know the simplest one is, I suppose, is do you work with your insurer to make sure that your insurance claim or your excess is reduced, your insurance costs are reduced as a result of doing good risk management. So stakeholder engagement.
That's obviously a massive part of it. And you mentioned the different industries there. You've worked in different industries as well. You're not just financial services, aren't you?
That's correct. So I've done oil and gas and energy, healthcare, public sector, government, and a smattering of manufacturing. I've also worked within financial services across banking, asset management, and insurance. Quite a wide scope.
Yeah. So again, for those kind of starting out their careers within the space, I mean, is there any, I don't know, in terms of fundamental differences applying risk management in those different spaces? Have you found that certain people or certain skill sets lend more towards certain industries, or would you say if you're a good risk practitioner, you could apply that across the different disciplines?
Well, it depends. So obviously I suppose the key difference is how quantitative you have to go. I mean, for example, in banking, there are certain regulations and methodologies that you have to follow for financial risks and how they're calculated. Whereas, of course, within say, for example, in healthcare and in public sector, you can use the standards like COSO or ISO 31000, and it tends to be a bit more of a semi-quantitative discipline. And again, the different industries allow you to align this with other sort of processes. So, for example, in healthcare, you've got clinical risk and the quality management movement and processes. And so for me, when you're looking at, I mean, patient safety is the number one risk, but it's also a key outcome of healthcare. So, quality management is all about managing that process and outcome. And therefore, it's beneficial to have risk management linked to those. So, I've worked in a number of private and public sector healthcare organisations and internationally, and absolutely linking to quality management is always a good thing to do, because you'll find that it also has an existing framework that you can lock into.
Right. Okay. So definitely there are different paths. I think a number of our listeners will be from the financial services side, but I know it's a question that does come up quite a lot about making that transition across to those other areas. And it sounds like there's a lot that you can learn and broaden your scope as well outside of financial services also.
That's correct. Yeah.
What about then again from a qualifications perspective? There's quite a lot of risk-based qualifications out there. Are there any in particular that you feel benefited you or that you particularly like at all?
So actually, I found that, I mean, I'm a bit biased because I've been heavily involved with the Institute of Risk Management now for about 15, 16 years. I was the chair of their board for a couple of years that ended in 2018. So, I mean, their qualifications are good because they are they're industry agnostic.
Okay.
So, they do take a full holistic enterprise risk view. And of course, there are different levels. And now what they've started to do is to then branch out into specific industry aligned. So they have a diploma in financial services risk, which covers both the quantitative and qualitative disciplines. Okay. I mean, Yeah, I think then what you want to do is you would supplement it if you were really, if you were wanting to get into the quantitative side of risk within banking and finance, you might do the Premier or GARP
Yes.
type certificates. And of course, if you're in compliance, then there's the Compliance Institute that have their own areas of qualifications. I mean, personally, I'm currently undertaking the Chartered Bankers Group with the Association of Foreign Banks have created a certificate in climate change risk.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, and they've also got a sustainable finance, green finance type certificate. So, it depends on really what is coming down the line in terms of regulation, the industry that you're in. But as I said, as a starting point to give you a baseline, I think the IRM's qualifications are good because they do reach across all industries and they take on the standards that have been developed. And then after you've done the baseline of those, you could then decide whether you want to specialise and look to the specific industry bodies that offer those specialised qualifications.
Yeah, fantastic. Because I definitely think that's the way forward. Again, this is why I was interested in your opinion, because there are a number of different options out there now, but that sounds like a good starting point for individuals as well.
Yeah,
Great. Sounds good. Okay. Well, look, here we are, 2022. Obviously, it's been an interesting couple of years for the world.
Yes.
Looking down the barrel now at 2022, in your opinion, what do you see as the biggest risk management challenges for firms out there?
So I think in terms of risks, obviously, these things, I mean, COVID was really good because what COVID demonstrated is it meant that a lot of organisations, and including the government, had to put in place in a short space of time some quite impactful policies and procedures. And for example, by working from home, we saw the impact of emissions reduction. So what would happen if we actually did manage climate change?
Yeah.
Right. So it allowed us to actually see some things. Our organisation, for example, before we were forced to go down the remote working track like everybody else.
Yes.
And I think that accelerated our ability to do that, because I think before COVID, although I was employed during the middle of COVID with the organisation, that I believe that the number of people that were able to work from home was quite limited. And so the flexibility around working and location of working was quite limited, which then loops back into your diversity agenda and inclusion agenda. So it's actually quite interesting because I think COVID has taught us how interrelated everything is.
Very much so.
Yeah, and I think so from an external perspective, it's a continuation of understanding how external events, risks can drive the need to understand the interrelationships within the organisation. And I think then internally, in terms of managing risk, the biggest limitation or the biggest challenge, and this has been around now for a little while, but it's just making it more acute, is data.
Yes.
Okay, because without good data, you can't actually get your evidence-based risk management information that allows you to make better decisions based on risk.
And have you found it's the challenge is more about availability of data, or is it the quality of the data that's available that you find the biggest challenge?
Well, I think it's a bit of both.
Right.
And I think, like, I will take climate change as an example. So I'm currently writing a climate change data strategy because we want to look at what we want to be able to measure and how we're going to do that. Excuse me. And it might actually mean, rather than relying on publicly available data, we've got to actually go and source information from the customer.
Right.
That customer might have interactions with goodness knows how many organisations all wanting the same data. So that puts a little bit of a onus on the organisation to be able to provide that, particularly if you're in a supply chain environment.
Yes.
So, I think it comes from both is, you could actually have quite a team of people just responding to requests for assurance and on data and things like that. What are you doing about ESG? What are you doing about climate change? How is this impacting you? Versus what's publicly available. And then there's now, I think, information overload on climate change data. There's so many research studies. In which one do you apply? Which ratings? I mean, I know that there's a new body that's been set up to standardize the climate change and ESG information, but it's still, it's still a bit of a minefield.
It is. I mean, how seriously do you feel like firms are taking climate change risk at the moment?
I think it's on everybody's radar. I think, again, it's industry specific.
Okay.
And obviously for me, I think from my own experience, I understand that besides regulation driving the need to take this on board, I think the investor community and the ratings agencies, the capital markets, are really pushing organisations to do something. But what we'll find soon is that people will just start to leave the organisations behind, particularly if they're listed.
Right.
And that's not just in this country, that's global.
Okay.
So,
yeah. In your experience, having worked for international organisations, with that global nature, obviously this is a problem that we've all got to join hands on. Do you feel like there is international collaboration with this subject? Are we joined up in approach?
Not quite there yet, but I think it's starting to mature.
Okay.
I think COP26 was a real sort of, it was a groundbreaker, because obviously there've been previous engagements for global participants, but there were some key decisions made there, and I think the development or the setup of this standards board that's going to drive out some consistency in the information data that's used to assess organisations' efforts at managing climate change and the broader ESG framework is the right direction, first steps. And I think that the international collaboration is absolutely now on everybody's radar in terms of what needs to happen. Yeah. Because as I said, we are, the world's a small place these days. And the global supply chain does actually, we've had supply chain issues recently that just actually, as I said before, demonstrate how interrelated not just organisations and risks within an organisation, but between organisations.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, yeah, it's interesting because again, it is a topic that everybody is talking about at the moment, and it does feel like that there's a lot of good minds that are being put to the task certainly from a financial services perspective in terms of what are our responsibilities, what are the impacts of what we are doing, and what can we be doing better to tackle this. I mean, is there anything in particular that you think banks in particular could be doing more of at the moment to tackle climate change risk?
Well, I think the big banks, I mean, the one thing we've got to be careful of is greenwashing, obviously for reputational risk perspective and to meet investor, I suppose, pressure. But the big banks have started, offering green mortgages, pricing accordingly, because they've got teams of people, and they've been, couple of years ago, obviously, when the supervisory statement came out from the PRA, Bank of England, they started looking at that, whereas smaller banks such as ours are only at the beginning of their journey. And for smaller banks like ours, I mean, our strategy is to incentivise before we penalise. Yeah. And the reason that we want to do that is if we start including, for example, detrimental lending criteria, that penalises industry that's heavy, intense emitters of CO2. Okay. What can happen then is we might make ourselves commercially uncompetitive.
Yes.
It's got to be a balance between risk and reward, and the commercial pressure sometimes does kick in. So it's more. I think for the smaller banks, it's all a matter of timing, right, as to when you actually do. We will introduce penalties. That means that, if we do lend to a fossil fuel type industry or a CO2 emitter that's intense, that we want them to, the pricing will be adjusted accordingly. Right. And then we've got to look at the other side too, when they're bringing carbon taxes or carbon pricing that's sensitive to the industry and the CO2s that they emit. Then obviously, that can also lead to impact on defaults. So you've got to look at it from both angles. And this is why, as I said to you, we need to sort of engage with our clients and really at some stage reach out and request the data that we need to be able to make decisions.
Right. So firms, in your experience, they're kind of trying to get ahead of the curve as much as they can, be on the front foot with this. before the regulators impose a certain, you talk about the balance of commerciality, that's always the kind of the key factor, and quite often it's the regulators who are imposing certain restrictions or certain guidelines that firms must follow in order to bring everybody in line, therefore it's a level playing field. Do you think the regulators are going to act on this sooner rather than later, or do you think it's going to take a bit of time to work out exactly the path we need to go down?
I think that, so for example, I know the Bank of England is in the second round of their exploratory scenario and stress testing.
Okay.
And I think will be interesting to see what comes out of that process. Yeah. And I know that the European CB is also undertaking a stress test as well. So I think all of these things are being used to inform the process. And so I think we need to wait and see what the jury's out at the moment on that until these things have been completed. But we, I think it's just keeping in touch with what the regulators' views are and potentially what they're doing. I mean, that the regulators in this country in particular are quite good. They they usually give you sufficient time to take on anything new that comes out of the processes that are informing their decisions.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's good reaction time to action those things. So okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
I mean, it's great to see that this is on the agenda and that this is actually being looked at, and it's not just a PR stunt, shall we say. It sounds like there's actually motion happening out there, which is great. This kind of leads me on to the next point, which I've been very interested in talking to my interviewees about, is the support you get from senior management. I think you kind of mentioned it earlier on. In some cases in the past, risk management has sometimes been seen as a little bit of a tick box department, whereas the reality is very, very different. And actually, a fully integrated risk management practice within a firm benefits significantly. Have you found that generally from the firms you've worked at, that there has been a strong kind of top-down approach from senior management with relation to risk?
Yeah, I mean, it's usually, as I said, the tone at the top is very important. But what I've found in organisations is actually, unless it's a regulated industry, it tends to come bottom up first.
Okay.
So you might get someone in the organisation that thinks risk management is a good idea, and they'll start working on their own off the side of their desk. This is, as I said, in my experience. And so what happens is those benefits are then, I suppose, senior management are informed, and then of course you get all it takes is one senior manager to start influencing from a top-down perspective and their colleagues, based off the back of the what we call the lone hero approach, because that's sometimes how it happens. But and then of course, as I said, or you might get somebody from a board or the audit committee, or to say, look, I think this is really good. I sit in other organisations where this is really working. I think it should be applied in this context. As I said, there's different for regulated industries where some of these things have to be done. And of course, these days is even listed companies have to do, when you look at the Financial Reporting Council and some of the requirements of listed companies. I mean, and this is back to when we look at the climate change agenda again. So the TCFD framework, now we're reporting from this year until between now and 2025 for different industries and types of companies is being brought in.
Okay.
So I think these days it would be quite rare to find an organisation that doesn't have some sort of risk management within it, whether it's regulated or not, because the pressure is coming from so many different angles that it's difficult to avoid.
Yeah, very, very much so. Very much so. Okay, interesting. So aside from climate change risk, which I know you're very passionate about and is an integral part of the discussion this year, another point that is at the top of the agendas is diversity. It's a conversation that everybody's having. It's very important. Do you think, in your experience, that we have a problem at the moment? Specifically within risk management, do you feel like we have a problem with diversity at the moment? Are there other things we could be doing more?
So actually, diversity in risk management is the same as diversity in management. It's not, unless it's quite specific. So for example, you'll find that within risk management and the different disciplines, I look at financial services specifically. If you go and have a look at the number of candidates or the profile of quantitative type disciplines, you'll find it's over, it's a lot of men, right, from a gender perspective. And that's because in the past, women haven't gone into the quantitative disciplines.
Right.
You'll find in operational risk, for example, I see a lot of women in the operational risk side of things because, again, it depends on the industry. But within banking, I've seen where women have been senior management within operations and then have moved into risk management from within that side of the bank. And therefore, I mean, it's like, again, in healthcare. OK, you've got a lot of female senior risk managers because of the fact is that healthcare is oversubscribed by female.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's quite specific. So I don't think, but in broader terms, we'd have a round table. The IRM hosted a round table back in, I think it was 2018, and we did actually have this discussion. Is there an issue of diversity, particularly from a gender perspective within risk management? And this is the conclusion we came to, is that it's no different to management as a discipline.
Right.
That has got certain nuances depending on the industry and the way that people have evolved and grown into risk management, and how the discipline of risk management itself has evolved within that particular sector.
Yes. And I guess that discussion then would have come round to looking at the different stages. Obviously, you mentioned there, for example, people working operations and then moving across to risk. What about from, I guess, a grassroots level? Are we doing enough at the university-led level to encourage people to go into risk?
I'm not sure, to be honest with you. I mean, lots of courses and things out there. I think it has to start with schools, actually, not university, because I mean, you're in the recruitment sector, you know how it is. I mean, we'd love to have more female candidates coming forward, but if the candidate pool doesn't have the diversity within it, it's then very difficult in terms of getting diversity within an organisation when you're recruiting for a new role.
Yes.
So to me, it's how do you build, I think one of the key challenges is how do you build out the diversity of the recruitment pool?
Of course.
Right, for candidates. And university, again, you can only encourage people to participate in particular disciplines. And how do you do that? I mean, I've got a 14-year-old son at the moment who I say to him, well, what do you want to do? I mean, next year he's got to choose which subjects he wants. And I mean, at that age and the way that things are within that generation, he hasn't got a clue.
Yeah.
So how can you influence decisions at an early age within the school environment, so that then obviously when you get to the point where you've got to choose a university course, it becomes a little bit easier to go down a certain route into the risk management. So it's where does risk management, how can you use risk management in a job? It's always the thing, isn't it? I'm going to do a particular university course. What's available to me as work?
Right.
And I don't think that's very clearly articulated. If you get into a degree in risk management, what work can you do?
Right. And I guess you're right. When you look at it in the context of a teenager making choices on subjects, I guess it really does start back at that teenage level, because those decisions will influence if a career like this is suited and accessible to you. So I guess that makes a big difference. So how did women in risk come about?
So Women in Risk came about when I was on a trip within Dubai, actually.
Okay.
Because one of the things that always surprised me, and it was my ex-husband actually influenced the setup. We were having a few meetings in Turkey, and then we were in Dubai at a conference and talking to a lady that had been involved in setting up an Islamic business women's network.
Okay.
And I was quite surprised about how successful that had been, given we all have the view that culturally, women in the Middle East don't usually have senior positions, which is actually totally incorrect.
Right. Okay.
And then the same here in Turkey. I mean, I find that a lot of the, within the banking sector, in terms of some of the training that I was delivering, a lot of the senior managers in risk, surprisingly, were women.
Fantastic.
So, it was a surprise. And so we had sat down and we gauged the interest. And from there, I went back to, at the time I was at the chair at the IRM, and suggested that we set up the group under the IRM banner through LinkedIn. And as I said, I set it up through LinkedIn. I set up a website, which is still it's been revised at the moment. And from there, we just grew out the numbers. I'd like to be a little bit more proactive, but obviously it depends on how busy we are at work. So,
of course, where Nicola, where should our listeners go to find out more information about women in risk? Did you just say there's a website being developed at the moment? Did you say?
Yeah, I think the best way is to join the LinkedIn group.
Okay.
Right. So I think we've got about 400 members on there at the moment. The other thing I'm trying to also do is there's now, so since that was actually set up, there are a number of other women in risk and control is another group that's been established through ASIN, a company, and the lady that runs that, forgot her name now, Rupal Patel.
Yes.
And so we've connected and we try to do some things together, or we're planning to do more together. There's obviously within, like, Premier Network also has something similar. And so I did actually a couple of years ago connect with the Women, Every Woman network, and they've run a couple of forums that brings together all of the players in Women in Risk, and it was called the Women in Risk Forum. I think it's again, so they've had 3 now, and I think there's another one planned for later on this year.
Right.
So that's everywoman.com. So there's further information on there about actually events that are taking place. And I mean, Women in Risk as well, probably in the second half of the year, we're going to try and run more, I suppose, in how face-to-face activities.
Okay.
So as I said, I think that the LinkedIn group is probably the best place to start with.
Okay. Well, listeners can head there for that. So the main aim from a sort of a week-to-week perspective then is for events to be run, for ideas to be shared, advice and guidance, that type of thing.
Yep. So, and also, just sharing information about, I think, the conversation that we're having now. How do you get into risk? What's your experience been? How do you deal? If you find yourself sitting in a committee where you're the only female and everybody else is male, how do you deal with that? We talk about women in risk, but we also want to discuss what the cross-cultural aspects are as well, which is something a little bit different to what the other groups do. Because I travel so much, I meet women globally around the world that are involved, but also, as I said, the country that you come from, your socioeconomic status, so all of the other diversity areas cross over with gender in a big way, and I think that shouldn't be forgotten. So trying to make sure that we cover that from a holistic perspective.
Yeah, very much so. Very, very much so. I mean, do you think? I know we've talked more specifically about the sort of the gender gap that exists. Do you think firms could be doing more in certain areas to try and close that gap?
I mean, obviously, yes. I think the issue is in the past, where salary was based on years of experience, and women used to take time off, obviously, to have families, that they then became sort of that was detrimental to their career progression. I think that's changing now, because your career pathway is not based on how many years you've been working for a particular organisation. It's based on your different approaches, your recognition that you can contribute in different ways. It's changing. And I think that does have an impact. But as I said before, it's difficult when you don't have a candidate pool. I mean, so for example, one of the things that we've recommended and we've tried to do within National Bank of Kuwait, because I've been recruiting on and off for the last 12 months, is what we call the language that you use. Actually, when you do a role profile, can actually have a difference on the type of people that apply. Right.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So using soft language skills, so good at communication, stakeholder engagement, rather than, competitive, able to stand on your own ground. I mean, these are the things that you still need to be able to do, but it's the way that you put that across.
Yes.
Because women tend to want to be able to tick all the boxes in a job description, whereas men, this is from research, will show that actually if they cover 70% of the role profile, they'll still apply.
Right.
Whereas a woman, I think, feels that they need to have 95% of it. So that's the other thing as well, is encouraging people to challenge themselves when applying for a role. And I think what we call blind recruitment processes, so that you don't know the gender of the applicants.
Yeah.
I mean, we do quite a bit of unconscious bias training. So yeah, it's we can do all of these things, but as I said, you can't do much if the candidate pool isn't diverse.
It is. So yeah, I think the unconscious bias tackling is definitely something that a lot of firms are looking at addressing, and blind CVs, as they call
Yes.
them, is a much more commonplace thing now. And I think it's really important. I do think it's really important, because everybody should be judged upon the merit of their application rather than any other factor. It makes a lot more sense to do that. It's great to see also initiatives being run. I know you mentioned about women having children and how that can sometimes set back in terms of career steps. It's also great to see out there's a lot more schemes now. Morgan Stanley, for example, run the Return to Work program to help those individuals looking to get back in, and not always in a full-time capacity. So it's really, really good to see that these type of initiatives are being run out there to help people engage again and get back in and help them progress.
Absolutely. And I think COVID has really opened a lot of people's eyes as to, well, actually, flexible working is possible.
It is.
And, it does really contribute to the diversity and inclusion agenda.
Well,
I think inclusiveness is actually quite challenging, though, when you're working virtually a lot of the time. And so when I go into the office, I usually try to keep my diary clear of meetings. They use the day-to-day meetings, because I'm not going to go to the office to sit on Teams all day long. I want to go to the office where I can interact with my team members face to face.
Absolutely.
And make sure that we cover the inclusion agenda. I mean, we currently I have an initiative. It's called the 3 E's of risk: empowerment, enjoyment, and engagement, to make sure that everyone in my team is able to have those 3 things in their role. Because if you're not engaged, inclusiveness is not there. Empowered to make decisions around their role without being micromanaged, and that they've got to enjoy the role that they're doing. Otherwise, why come to work? It's like,
absolutely.
It's just, and that seems to be going down quite well. I mean, it's in its early stages, but we're just conscious of it when we're making decisions about different roles and the way that we interact with each other.
And I think that's ever more important now, that I think the world is going to continue in this hybrid state for a period of time now. I think this is probably going to be the new norm. So you're going to need to make sure, how do you make sure people are okay? How do you take into account all of those? I like those E's that you've just given there. I think it makes a lot of sense. Arguably, during the pandemic, a lot of people did struggle a little bit with the mental health, and engaging is a key thing of that. You need to have that water cooler conversation as much as you need to have the professional conversation. So I think it's probably helped us all to be able to go back into the office and to be able to work with our team, meet with our stakeholders, and actually have a face-to-face conversation. So that all makes a lot of sense.
Yep, absolutely. And I mean, I think in the last 6 months, I've done one face-to-face engagement at a conference. But they're starting to come back in now. I've still got. I'm speaking at quite a few events actually in the next sort of 6 months. But I find that about 60% of them are actually now being organised for face-to-face, and 40% still virtual.
Very interesting.
And I'd say, and there's also some that are hybrid, where they're planning to do a bit of both, where they're offering the technology is now available that you can sit in a conference hall and see people, and what it means is they can actually then expand the audience participation from outside of our own countries, because they can attend virtually. So and it's again, a good thing.
Absolutely. And again, going back earlier, talking about the joined up approach to tackle some of these topics, the wider audience you can reach, the easier and more consistent it's going to be. All sounds good.
Absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. Well, just to close off then, knowing what you know now, if you were to flash back in time to when you were beginning your career, is there a piece of advice that you give to yourself about a career in risk management?
Well, as I said, because I landed into it by mistake, it wasn't planned. I wouldn't change anything, actually. I must admit, I've been quite, I don't know whether you call this fortunate or unfortunate, that I actually have worked for some very challenging organisations. So I've seen what goes wrong when you don't do risk management properly. And therefore, I think that's taught me a lot more than if you go into an organisation where you're introducing risk management and you don't have those challenges. especially implementation challenges about, asking people to understand the benefits. I mean, I do remember for one public sector body, I was the head of risk for. The first time I was asked, are these the real risks? Where did you get, who said this is high, who said that's low, type thing? And it's because, and my response at that point was just think on my feet. Well, actually, even if the risk isn't the risk level that it's purported to be, people's perception is what drives their actions.
Of course.
So actually, I think more focus on the soft side of risk management. And I know it's a very subjective subject, but if your team or the organization has a perception that a particular risk is a high risk, even though it might not be, or the evidence is not there to support it, the decisions that they make subconsciously on a day-to-day basis will be driven by that level of understanding.
Yeah, of course.
And therefore that needs to be acknowledged. And that's really where I maybe could have done a bit more. But as I said, I think I've been quite lucky in that I've worked in challenging environments, and it's allowed me to see what bad looks like, and also then to work with people to see good looks like.
Yeah.
And I think my advice to people, if you can work in cross industry, because I do see a lot of people, well, from probably the side of the have been in the nation 10 years, they are being the head of, and they have a lack of in their own judgment because they haven't seen what goes on in risk organisations, and therefore not really sure whether they're doing what. That's why the consultant, or hence why I think it's good to connect, and you don't have to pay to come give you advice.
Yeah.
You can compare and contrast with your. I think that's the advice is try to work as much as possible.
Yeah, fantastic, brilliant. Well, look, Nicola, thank you so much for your time today. Really insightful discussion, and very interesting to hear about women in risk and the agenda for this year. It sounds like it's going to be a very busy time and busy group. I'm sure our viewers will look that up on the LinkedIn page for women in risk. And I wish it every success going forward. Brilliant. Look, thank you all for listening. As per, you'll see on our website, for all of your hiring needs across the governance space, feel free to get in touch with us here at the Risk Partners. Head over to theriskpartners.com for more information. Nicola, thank you so much for your time, and we'll speak to you very soon.
Thank you.